question we are asking ourselves right now on VisualPolitik is, are we facing the Iranian Spring? At the time of making this video, Iranians have been rising up and protesting against the Ayatollahs regime for more than a month. In other words, we're not just talking about another demonstration, nor is it a protest against a specific policy. Instead, hundreds of thousands of Iranians have been confronting the police and armed forces for weeks in an attempt to overthrow the regime of the Ayatollahs once and for all. So the question today is, are we really witnessing an Iranian Spring? Is this going to be the good news event of 2022? I don't know if you actually realize the importance of what we're talking about here, but if these protests succeed in overthrowing the Ayatollahs, we could be talking about a serious historical event, an event as important as the outcome of the war in Ukraine. You don't believe me? Well, think of it like this. The Islamic Republic of Iran is much more than a simple theocracy. To begin with, we are talking about a country with more than 83 million inhabitants. In terms of gas and oil, they can give any monarchy in the Gulf a run for their money. If Iran could sell its resources on the international market, it would be much easier to put an end to the current energy crisis. So why don't they just sell them? Very simple, because of the economic sanctions. Ayatollah Khamenei is not content with just oppressing his own people. He also wants to spread his Islamic revolution throughout the region. As you know, Iran has been trying for decades to develop its own nuclear bomb. This in itself makes Iran a real headache in terms of international security. However, what if we are facing an Iranian Spring? What if all these protests succeeded in overthrowing the Ayatollah's regime? Could we see a democratic Iran? That would be a dream come true. We're not only talking about good news in terms of human rights, although obviously that would be the case, but it would also be a big relief in terms of both international security and international markets. I know what many of you are thinking now. This sounds a little too good to be true. Do you know what? You're probably right. Actually, this is not the first time that Iranians have taken to the streets. We already saw protests against rigged elections in 2009, and we also saw protests in 2019. In this case, the protests were motivated by the country's bad economic situation. Have we seen a change for the better in Iran? Well, no, it's actually kind of the opposite. For the last decade, the president of Iran was this gentleman you see on the screen, Hassan Rouhani, a president of the moderate wing of the regime. However, since 2021, Iran has had this other gentleman as president. We are talking about Ibrahim Raisi, who belongs to the hardcore wing of the theocratic regime. In other words, Iranians have never had it worse. Not only have they been economically isolated for 4 years with all that implies, crisis, inflation, and unemployment, in addition, the government is also increasingly oppressive and authoritarian. And so, the question we are asking today is, can these protests really put an end to the Ayatollahs once and for all? How are they different from previous protests we've seen in Iran? Are we really facing an Iranian Spring? And could Iran end up worse off than it was, as has happened in many locations of the other Arab Springs? Today, we're going to answer all of these questions, but first, let's look at some history. It may come as a surprise to you, but there is one issue that Iran's religious leaders are truly obsessed about: clothing. Literally, for Ayatollah Khamenei, the clothes people wear on the streets is a fundamental issue. Everyone must dress according to their interpretation of Islam.
Hijab gives women freedom and identity in spite of the senseless and superficial propaganda campaigns launched by materialistic people. Hijab does not shackle women. Ayatollah Khamenei.
And this obsession reached such a point that in 2005, he created the so-called guiding patrols, better known as the morality police. We are talking about a police force whose sole mission is to patrol the streets, making sure that no one does immoral things. And mainly, immoral things translates into dressing inappropriately. As you can imagine, this affects women in particular. Not only are they obliged to wear the hijab, they have to wear it properly. And believe me, this is much more important than you might think. To give you an idea, in August of 2022, the Office for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice went so far as to publish a 119-page document to clarify how a woman should dress. Even so, the practices of these moral police are totally arbitrary. To put it another way, even if you are a woman and wear a hijab, the morality police can still arrest you on the grounds that you are wearing it incorrectly. Normally, they would take you to an office where they would give you a re-education course. Afterwards, a family member has to pick you up and bring appropriate clothing so you are fit to go out on the street. However, if you re-offend, you can end up paying fines, going to jail, and facing all kinds of beatings. Here's a fun fact for you. The morality police have gender quotas. You heard that correctly. Men are not allowed to frisk women, and that's why most patrols are composed of 2 men and 2 women. And believe me, these patrols don't have the slightest qualms about the most brutal beatings that you can possibly imagine. Since 2005, these patrols have been making arbitrary arrests all over the country. However, in 2021, with a new and even more radical government, new police were hired. In other words, there were more and more morality police patrolling and torturing people on the streets. However, the case that has finally exhausted the patience of the Iranians was this news story.
Mahsa Amini, left in a coma by Iran's morality patrol, dies in hospital.
Mahsa Amini was a young Kurdish girl who was brutally beaten by the morality police. The regime justified the murder by saying that the girl had previous health problems, but Iranian activists obtained the recordings of the beatings by police officers. This news has shocked most Iranians, and this is how the biggest protests in the recent history of the country were unleashed. However, make no mistake, the murder of Mahsa Amini was the final straw. In reality, Iranians have been going to protest for many different reasons, and we're going to look at them right now.
The pie is smaller but shared among fewer.
Iran is one of the most isolated countries in the world. Back in 2018, Trump imposed a sanctions regime that includes secondary sanctions. Conclusion: almost no one can do business with the country, not even with the huge Iranian oil and gas fields. So how do they survive in such a situation, you might ask? Well, we could sum it up in one sentence. The pie is smaller, but it is shared among far fewer. Surprisingly, one of the first effects of the sanctions on Iran was the rise of the Iranian stock market. In fact, even measured in dollars, in 2019, the Tehran Stock Exchange was the stock exchange that appreciated the most worldwide. Surprising, right? Well, in a way, it actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, think about it this way. Since Iranians can no longer take their money out of the country, they can only invest in local companies. And since the local currency keeps losing value, the stock market is seen as a kind of safe haven for savings. In addition, Iran's own clerical rulers encouraged ordinary people to buy shares, ordinary citizens as well as state-owned companies, something that further fueled the demand for shares. Some will say that the sanctions have been great news for Iran, right? No, nothing of the sort. Think of it this way, Iran can no longer export almost any goods abroad. This in itself is lousy news for all Iranian companies, but it has an added effect. If virtually no one in the world buys Iranian stuff, no one needs to buy rials, which is the Iranian currency, to pay for goods. This means demand for Iranian rials has plummeted. In 2018 alone, following the announcement of Trump's sanctions, the currency devalued by more than 60% on the official market and more than 80% on the free market. This has a direct consequence: inflation, rampant inflation. To give you an idea, there are many basic products such as a tube of toothpaste that change price every day. Make your jokes about my teeth in the comments. And what happens when a country has astronomical inflation? If you're watching this video from a country like Argentina, you already know the answer. Try to save with a safe haven like the dollar or the euro. And just as in Argentina, the government has an official exchange rate that has little or nothing to do with the market price. As you can imagine, companies connected to the government can get dollars at this advantageous exchange rate. The rest of the citizens could only buy up to 2,000 euros or dollars per year. However, ordinary Iranians are used to getting dollars illegally on the street. There are even websites where they publish the official exchange rate and the real exchange rate. Suddenly, smuggling has become a very lucrative industry, especially in cities that are on the borders with other countries. While all of this is going on, the elites connected to the Ayatollahs are living it up. They have gained the most absolute control of Iran. But of all the major beneficiaries of the Iran sanctions, there is one institution that takes the cake. I'm sure many of you already know or can imagine who we're talking about, especially if you've seen all the videos we've dedicated to Iran on VisualPolitik in the past. By the way, if you're interested, we have a whole playlist just about this country. So who are we talking about? Exactly, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. As you guys probably know, Iran has two parallel armies. On the one hand, there is the regular army, and on the other hand, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. But how is it possible for Iran to have two different armies? To understand, we have to go back to 1979, when Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah of Persia and seized power. Khomeini did not trust the Iranian army, which originally had been loyal to the Shah. So he created a kind of Praetorian Guard, whose mission was to defend the values of the Islamic Revolution. But make no mistake, the Guard is not just a few soldiers protecting the leader. Not at all. We are talking about a fully fledged army with more than 50,000 soldiers, a well-armed and well-trained elite corps. And you may ask, but how is this Islamic Revolutionary Guard financed? No matter how well trained they are, they need weapons, and those weapons cost money. Well, take a close look at this graph. As you can see, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard has a larger budget year after year. Even ignoring the calculation in dollars, its budget has increased in recent years. In other words, Iranians are getting poorer and poorer, but the regime considers it a priority to feed an increasingly powerful guard. And wait a moment, because that's not all. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard is not only financed by the taxes of the long-suffering Iranians, they also have their own businesses. And we're not just talking about a few small companies here. It is estimated that 80% of Iran's entire economy right now is in the hands of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Of course, much of Iran's oil and gas is in their hands. They control the main gas fields in the south of the country. But we're not only talking about natural resources. For example, they are the main shareholder of the two largest telecommunications companies in the country. And what about construction? Iran's leading construction company also belongs to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. To give you an idea, in September of this year, they had 285 active projects, and there was never a shortage of public work projects. For example, this year, 2020, they have started a project valued at $100 million to renovate the country's mosques. In other words, sanctions in Iran have had two effects: widespread poverty and enormous inequality. This is the perfect cocktail for generating social unrest. All that was missing was a spark to ignite the protests, and that spark has been this.
Much more than protests.
When we talk about Iran, we have to keep in mind one very important thing. Unlike Saudi Arabia, Iran has a secular population that does not want to live in a theocracy. In fact, when Khomeini seized power in 1979, he needed the help of secular groups like the Communist Party. Of course, within a few years, Khomeini took it upon himself to neutralize these threats. But Iranian society is well educated and not as radicalized as in other Muslim countries. This explains why Iran has had so many waves of democratic protests in the past. In the 1990s, they had several student protests. Then in 2009, many Iranians demonstrated against what they saw as election fraud. In 2019, Iran's working classes took to the streets, this time calling for economic reforms. However, none of these protests demanded total regime change. In comparison, the slogans being chanted on the streets of Iran right now are completely different. Check this out.
Demonstrators chant "Death to the dictator" in Tehran as protests spread.
Exactly. For the first time in Iran, we see people calling for a total regime change. And they go so far as to say "death to the dictator" or "death to the Ayatollah." In other words, the tone has changed. But that's not all. We are talking about protests that have spread all over the country, from the capital, Tehran, to the small towns on the border. And as you can imagine, the Iranian police have responded with the brutality you have come to expect. However, unlike in previous protests, the protesters are now fighting back.
Iran says 5 guards, including 2 colonels, killed after clashes in southeast.
This is what is already known as the Zahedan massacre. Not only guards were killed, of course, they also killed 96 protesters. Zahedan is a city that is here on the border with Afghanistan and Pakistan. Remember how smuggling is one of the main industries in Iran under sanctions? Well, in the areas that border Iran and Pakistan, getting a smuggled weapon is very easy, and that has led to violent clashes. This is causing the police to be overwhelmed and unable to suppress the protests. We have all seen pictures of girls taking off their hijab in front of the police or burning pictures of Khomeini. From what we are hearing from people who are in Iran, Tehran is still relatively under the control of the regime, but the peripheral areas are getting more and more complex. And the question many of you may be wondering now is, what can the West do to help overthrow the Ayatollahs? And the answer is very little. Many activists are calling for more sanctions against the children of the elites because many of them are living in Western countries. But is it possible to arm the protesters? The truth is that would be a very risky decision. Remember that Iran has a police force and an Islamic Revolutionary Guard that is well trained, and that training specializes precisely in urban guerrilla warfare and insurgency. Even if the protesters were to achieve some of their political objectives, all these troops could continue to fight. It is not crazy to think that all these protests could trigger would be a full-blown civil war. For the moment, there is only one thing we can say. Iran's regime has never been under so much pressure. Not even mass arrests or the killing of civilians has served to quell the protests. And now, the questions are over to you. Are we really facing the end of the Ayatollahs regime? Is a regime change even possible in this country without a civil war? You can leave me your answer in the comments below. As always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it so we know. All the best, and I'll see you next time.